is a Philadelphia-centered and member-supported library, research archives, and community forum. It's been around since 1814, and we continue to be a lively place, even more lively physically when we don't have a pandemic going on, but we've been managing to keep a pretty lively schedule going with our virtual programs. I am Beth Hessel, the Executive Director, and I am so pleased that all of you are with us this evening. Tonight, we have a great program, and before I introduce our guest speaker and moderator, I want to remind you all that if you want to just look at who's speaking, which will be the two, you can hit at the top right-hand corner of your screen if you're on a laptop or computer, the speaker view, and that will just show you who's talking, so you won't be looking at Tess and I while they're talking. And the bottom, you see both the Q&A and the chat. You can ask questions anytime during the talk, in the Q&A or the chat, and when Koa and Camille are done with their conversation, I will moderate those questions so they can answer everything that's burning in your mind that comes up from the conversation. And now I would like to introduce to you our guest speaker is Koa Beck, who is the author. You can see the book on her screen, and well, I've got the virtual background, so it doesn't work so well, but White Feminism, from the suffragettes to influencers and who they leave behind. I'm about halfway through and enjoying the book very much. It's got a lot of food for thought, new ways of thinking about how we might understand feminism and make a more inclusive movement that truly lifts everybody up. Koa is the former editor-in-chief of the magazine Jezebel, and she previously was also executive editor of Vogue and was an editor of marieclaire.com and co-host of the hashtag MeToo memos on WNYC's The Takeaway. Her writing has appeared in magazines all over the place, and she received a Joan Shorenstein Fellowship at the Harvard Kennedy School in 2019, which I think was helpful for you in finishing your work. And she lives in Los Angeles with her wife, where she's getting all her great haircutting skills too. So it's a delight to have Koa here, and it is wonderful that Koa is going to be in conversation with Camille Perri, who lives in the DC area and is the author of the novels The Assistants and When Katie Met Cassidy, both of which have been optioned for feature films with her attached as a screenwriter. So we look forward to seeing those come to the big or small screen at some point in the future. Camille is a former editor at Cosmopolitan and Esquire, and her essays on queer identity and culture have been widely published. She has a Bachelor's of Arts degree from New York University and a Master's of Library Science degree from Queens College. So we could get you here sometime to talk about libraries at the Athenaeum.
I'd love to.
I want to turn it over to you, Camille and Koa, for your conversation. And after your conversation, we will take the Q&A from our guests tonight. So welcome, everybody. Give a virtual welcome to Koa Beck and Camille Perri.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. We're thrilled to be doing this event together. When my first book came out, Koa was the person who did a Q&A for me when it was my turn to have my big event that I was excited about. And so now I'm thrilled to be getting to return the favor and do that for Koa. Koa, I'd like to start absolutely at the beginning. Can you define white feminism for anyone who maybe isn't exactly sure what that term means?
Happily. I also want to thank the Athenaeum and Beth and Tess for organizing all of the logistics so that we can be here and actually speak together. And especially you for talking to me in front of all these nice people. I miss you a lot.
Miss you too.
I define very early in the book, in the introduction, I define white feminism very intentionally to give people a working definition of what I'm talking about, but also something that they can track and hopefully identify, in their own life and organizations, workplaces, movements, schools, things like that. I define white feminism as a very specific approach and ideology towards achieving gender equality that pulls considerably from colonialism, imperialism, some key pieces from white supremacy as well, but a lot of the narratives and understanding of success are rooted very deeply in capitalistic ascension, and particularly individual accumulation of wealth as being an indicator of quote unquote progress.
So when did feminism officially become white?
I argue that feminism officially became white during the very heavily covered and famous 1913 suffrage. You could argue it's like a procession, but it was like a march, and it was designed to be a very public march in support of suffrage. A big engineer in that march was a suffragist named Alice Paul, who is, you can find out a lot about her. I explore her a lot in my book to make key points about white feminism. But she is a really celebrated American suffragist. And a lot of what shaped and influenced her politics, particularly around women's rights, was optics, and particularly like press narratives. So she grew up in a Quaker household. Her family was very economically secure. She grew up on the East Coast. And also because she was a Quaker, a lot of egalitarian principles between men and women were really innate to how she grew up, to the point that, you know, when she got older and left her Quaker upbringing, she was very earnestly and in some ways adorably surprised that there were differences between men and women as they moved through society, and that women got very different messages about what was expected of them, and also just like literal spaces they could participate in versus men, because that's not how her community was and that's not how her faith was. She also grew up, because of her faith, her mother in particular took her to a lot of suffrage meetings, where previously what historians deem like the radical suffragettes, so Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, those ladies, the suffrage efforts that they had tried to get off the ground that had not worked. And so now Alice Paul, as a little girl, was in these suffrage meetings with her mother while they were talking about what would happen next. How Alice in particular really solidified feminism becoming a movement for white women and white women's rights really happened after she went to the UK to study. According to historians, she got very radicalized by the UK suffrage movement, in that these women were very different from the sort of Quaker sensibilities around suffrage, where everything was very like quiet, demure. A lot of these meetings happened in, like, you know, women's homes. They were private. People spoke in low voices. They had tea there. Everything was quote unquote very civilized. The suffragists in the UK were not willing to be so polite in their advocacy for women's rights, and especially the right to vote. A lot of their politics very intentionally strategized around being as public as possible and around being as unruly as possible. They screamed on street corners, they broke windows, they were arrested by police. And the idea was that in them doing that and making a quote unquote spectacle of themselves, they were drawing attention to the urgency of suffrage in newspapers. So when Alice Paul came back to the United States, that was something that had influenced her very deeply in her time abroad, and something she wanted to bring to the American movement. The way that she thought about this, especially in keeping the optical dimensions foremost important, was that she really wanted to present a homogenized movement for women's rights. And it wasn't just her, but a number of suffrage organizations that she participated in and in some cases led. She was very adamant that suffrage not only be publicized a lot in the press, but that suffrage look a certain way. And the way that she shaped that was by making sure that the suffragists that you saw walking towards the White House who were protesting, they were all white, they were all very thin, they were all able-bodied, they were all very conventionally feminine. They all aspired to be wives and mothers. also very conventionally gorgeous. The fact that the march was covered so heavily by press was not an accident. Alice and her organizers had a big hand in making sure that photographers were there, that they got pictures of very conventionally gorgeous women protesting. And the idea was that, suffrage, at least, as far as Alice Paul could envision and what she was trying to export, was that suffrage was, affirming to broader America that they shared these values of what a woman was supposed to be. Suffrage wasn't challenging them. And that when you thought of the women who wanted the right to vote, you were supposed to think of women who looked like this. You're supposed to think of very young women who are conventionally feminine, who wanted to be mothers, who wanted to be wives, and that it played to, I think, a key part of American paternalism, in the sense that you were supposed to think of your daughter, you're supposed to think of like these really good, well-behaved women who just wanted to do what you wanted them to do anyway. But while there's a lot of like class and racialized elements to that, in my book, I document that really came to a head when, at the build up to this march, there were suffragists who were Native, there were suffragists who were Black, and they started to ask and write if they could come to the march, at which point Alice Paul freaked out because having women of color at the march, a very optical march that was going to be covered extensively by newspapers and export this idea of suffrage everywhere, it was supposed to carry a very homogenized white visual. And Black women being there would complicate that, in that they were only advocating for, the rights of white women. But a lot of the language that they used regarding women's rights was about quote unquote women's rights, kind of like now. So a lot of this came to a head when Black suffragists arrived at the march anyway. Alice Paul and her organizers freaked out. They had a very, I was delighted to find this piece in my own research. They had sort of a dress rehearsal where things really got tense, and they still hadn't decided, whether Black suffragists would, one, even be allowed at the march, or that they would segregate, or whether they would just call off the march altogether. And at the very last minute, they decided to segregate. So that is the, if you've ever, heard about marches in which, Black suffragettes were told to go to the back of the line, that is literally that march. And that really set into motion this idea that feminism, quote unquote, as a word, that was for white women. And Black women, Native women, Chicanas, everyone else would really either not exist in this movement, or very metaphorically, and in their case, sometimes literally, be at the back.
As you were relaying all of that, I couldn't help but think of the Women's March that we all experienced and saw just after Trump was elected. And what I know of that Women's March, a lot of these same issues sort of played out exactly very similar to what you just described back then. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the parallels of how little has changed in terms of that?
Sure. So I document this in the book as well, to draw a lot of very intentional parallels, especially just like Camille raised. I'm sure a lot of you remember as Women's March was starting to ascend and gain momentum shortly after Trump was elected. There were a lot of differing and at times like competing narratives of what Women's March was and who it was for. I cite in my book very intentionally, there was a fair amount of reporting. Sorry, hi Mandana. My very enthusiastic friends, thank you for coming. There was a fair amount of competing narratives surrounding like not only necessarily who the march was for, but different expectations around gender rights when people got there. And a number of white women who were very enthusiastic about attending the march were very, in some ways, put off by the insistence that the march, would be inclusive of a lot of different platforms, not just the needs of white middle-class women who were straight, who were cisgendered, but also immigration reform and police reform and healthcare and trans rights and Native women's rights. And this insistence at times from the organizers themselves on social media that the march would reflect this collided really brutally with the white feminist ideology, in that, as I examine in my book, it became really evident that a lot of self-identified feminists who were white, who were planning to come to this march, interpreted that as them being decentralized in this conversation about women's rights and also what was happening post-Trump in this country. And the way they interpreted that was by canceling their trip. And this was, I document this a lot in terms of like social media posts and, what was reported by a number of outlets. And I think it's really telling that, one, a number of these women just expected to be centralized in this conversation. A lot of them who were feminist identified or saw the need to participate in a public demonstration of gender rights against Trump in this very public way, weren't necessarily, class literate people. They weren't necessarily racially literate people. They still, much like Alice Paul, and her organizers, they still expected to be the ones leading the march.
Right.
And it's a very, very similar dynamic, and it's played out a lot in organized gender rights in this country.
Yeah, you mentioned race, class. Capitalism is a word that you've said, I think, more than once since we've been talking. So how wrapped up is white feminism? How wrapped up is it with capitalism as a system?
White feminism.
It's a small question. It's not a, we're going to solve it right now. But
white feminism is, for all intents and purposes, white feminism is married to capitalism. And a lot of narratives in this country about women's rights that white feminism has supported, advocated, exported, and in some ways designed, it's not only rooted in capitalism, but its benchmarks are capitalistic. So I explore this in the book a lot, like a lot of, national conversations that I've had to report on, in my career, or that, I've had to witness, either just like being in public spaces or, just reading about quote unquote feminism. Like a big dialogue that has really persisted is that, for instance, like, parental leave in this country, if you offer paid parental leave, it's better for businesses. So, and I pull some studies that show that, especially on a lot of panels that I've, been on or had to like attend in my career, that is a talking point that has been espoused again and again, that if you support paid parental leave, it's ultimately better for the company because you don't have like the high cost of turnover. So like women leaving the workforce because the parental leave is very poor, and then you have to sink in the costs of like training new employees and all that sort of thing. And then like some of those employees will have babies and then leave. This is a very limited way to discuss gender rights because it's quantified and entirely encased by money. And again, white feminism has always been very, very invested in ascending within the current system. It's never been about structural critique or even like considering those thresholds by which women are quantified, such as money. I think that another talking point of that ilk that was really popular around the time that I was in newsrooms was this idea that like if you have, and again this is cited in the book for people who are interested, if you have a gender equity on your board, for instance, your company is more profitable. So again, like money as the benchmark for gender progress has always been a very keen metric for white feminism, but for reasons that I get into in the book, leaves a ton of people out, marginalized genders, across race and class and sexuality, and that like most marginalized genders in this country don't have money. And a lot of times they're not even necessarily looking to get money. They're looking to have like a basic standard of living. They're looking for affordable housing. They want to be food secure. They want healthcare. But in the United States, and specifically through white feminist messaging, that has become very muddied with like having power and like having a senior leadership position, in a corporate presence. And if you're talking about most women in this country, they're not necessarily looking for power in that sense of the word. They just want a basic standard of living. But white feminism has never been that movement.
A lot of American individualism tied into that, I think, you know, thinking in terms of, let me get my piece of the pie, and, you know, forgetting about what's best for the most amount of people, and how we could all kind of, you know, it's like trickle down, it's trickle down feminism.
Yes, which I cite in the book.
I think, is that where I heard that? I thought I came up with that just now on the fly.
I didn't invent it. It's been said before. I think that that's one of the reasons too why I think that white feminism has been an enduring narrative of women's rights in this country, because it keeps to a lot of our same like racist, capitalistic, like class infused values about being very individually focused, just wanting what's best for you, your family, your spouse, your education, your career. And yet, you know, so many other feminisms in this country and movements for women's rights have been very critical and skeptical of capitalism. And that's not even like a, you know, intellectual like women's studies course. Like, it's very intuitive in terms of money doesn't necessarily convey power. Although, you know, for white feminism, it does. And I explore in the book, it's one of the reasons I argue that is because white feminism does pull considerably from patriarchy, and that it doesn't rethink necessarily power structures, you know, or different avenues by which you can have value as a human being, you know, outside of economized labor.
Right. Yeah. Turning a bit, so we've both spent some time working for women's magazines.
We have.
We have. How would you say that the women's magazines, or like women's media in particular, just how white is their brand of feminism, and do you think it's improving at all?
You know, I don't know if I can speak to if it's improving, because I haven't been really in any newsroom since 2018. And I know that doesn't seem like that long ago, but in digital media, which is how I came up, that's a really long time to not be in a newsroom. So I actually don't know. I am delighted to see the push for unionization at a number of these companies, you know, specifically where you and I worked, and then, you know, even broader, like at Condé Nast. And I think just the support of a union indicates like great cultural shifts since you and I have been with a lot of these brands, where there like wasn't even literacy of a union or what it was or how it can like help women, or, you know, any of those talking points that I now see just kind of being casually flung about on Twitter, which is wonderful. I think that for a long time, the quote unquote feminism that has been exported by mainstream women's media is very white, and very white on purpose, in the sense that, you know, kind of like when we're talking about broader, you know, US society in terms of values, you know, these magazines are corporations. They value money, they value ad buys, they value, you know, people buying things, like supporting products. And if you're talking about like a, you know, push for gender equality that challenges like women being paid less, or like, you know, women and other marginalized genders having the ability to leave and raise children and come back to, you know, a secure job, or, you know, combating ageism, like making sure that you're still employing, you know, women over 50. I mean, like, corporations are not invested in that. And I think that a lot of the feminism that has been enacted in these places where you and I have worked, it's branding, and it's really there to make the publication look a certain way. It's not necessarily reflective of like internal policies or like advancement for the women, you know, who actually work there and who do the labor of making sure that this, you know, monolithic message on like gender, you know, gets out there. I go into in the book, I mean, you know, part of the hypocrisy is like, for publications like that you and I have worked at, the championship of you know, women in leadership positions. So even if you're like only invested in, you know, this very white feminist understanding of like, you want more women in leadership positions and white collar labor, and like that's your only understanding of gender equality, while you and I have worked for a lot of places that have supported that message, like, you know, top to bottom, a lot of women that I've worked with and continue to mentor, you know, that help put out those messages in terms of writing that copy, interviewing career experts, you know, making sure that these are copy editor or whatever, they're terrified to ask for raises. They are, you know, discriminated against. They are up against really intense ageism in their workplace. I mean, it's a very, I think branding is really only the way to distill it. It's a PR narrative. It's not necessarily reflective of the structure.
Yeah, yeah, so true. One of my favorite scenes, it's not like it's fiction, but it sometimes it could read like, you know, a story, because you get, you know, it's page turning in that same way. But I love the section where you talk about the term, the future is female, and how it's the perfect case study in white feminism. So I was wondering if you could kind of break that down for the audience a little bit.
Happily. And actually, I think that, I mean, I've been getting all kinds of, you know, really sweet, like direct messages and people, you know, sharing all kinds of interpretations of the book with me, which I really love. But broadly, people have really gravitated towards that story, and I get a lot of responses to it. So I'm happy to talk about it. In our, you know, collective lifetime, the future is female has really become this all-encompassing phrase for like anything like remotely positive about women. So I watched it, especially in a lot of websites I worked at, like the future is female, like Hillary Clinton said it, you know, around the 2016 election. And then it just kind of ended up like all of a sudden you know, I was in like pitch meetings, and when we would be finalizing headlines, it was like, oh, the future is female, like there's a bunch of women that work here now. Like it just sort of, the elasticity of that phrase kept expanding and expanding to what you could use it for. And it was like anytime any woman had any sort of like personal win, the future is female. And like I started to see it even like removed from business, where it was like, you know, certain even like advances in like literacy of rape culture, all of a sudden like the future is female. I mean, it just like really took on a life of its own. Yet you know, when I went looking for the origins, which I roughly knew prior to writing this book, but I document in pretty like forensic detail, like how we got here with this phrase. The future is female is a deeply radical lesbian phrase. It started with a lesbian bookstore in New York, I believe. And then, you know, it has a very quick like acceleration from there in terms of like historical archives, but then it really disappeared. And then it, you know, popped up on Instagram, you know, with like somebody wearing a certain shirt. And then like famous people started wearing shirts that had it on there. And then all of a sudden Hillary Clinton says it. And then I do document in the book to show like a shift in like Google searches, you know, where it's like there are people Googling the future is female, but then very quickly it becomes commodified. So people are like, where, you know, can I get the future is female shirt, future is female sweatshirt? And I describe it as a perfect case study in white feminism, in that white feminism as an ideology and a practice has been really adept at sanitizing radical sentiment from its history. So like deeply, deeply radical, you know, politics, beliefs, ways of looking at the world, and then like literally putting them on a sweatshirt that you can buy at Nordstrom's. That is white feminism.
There it is.
And yeah, and usually with like a celebrity endorsement. So to me, especially like understanding that history and being aware of it and where it comes from, and then seeing it really take on this hugely commercialized life, you know, where it's really about like apparel and like wearing certain things and then like having a certain accessory, and then the fact that like nobody can really tell me, you know, what this means. It's just like a good positive thing for women opaquely. I think a place where I really saw it take on like a different commodified life too is that I started noticing that, you know, the future is female was being used to essentially affirm a gender binary. And that, when these radical lesbians said it, it was in a completely different context, as gender essentialist as they were. It had a different context in terms of like what was possible for marginalized genders. And even like I quote some comments later on, circa Hillary Clinton 2016, where like the phrase was being reinterpreted, to include like trans people and like mothers with their sons and things like that. But that wasn't really carrying over in the like highly commercialized white feminism space, where it was like when I was being confronted with the future as female, on the cover of like a magazine where you and I worked, for instance, it was to affirm gender binary scripts. So the future is female. All of these, thin, able-bodied young actresses are very rich and make a lot of money and like are very pretty and influential. The future is female. And like, yeah, like I think about that in terms of just, data and reports that I've read throughout my career. And yeah, like women who are cisgendered, who are conventionally feminine, who are straight, who come from middle to upper class backgrounds, yeah, they make a lot of money. They, can support themselves and their families. They're influential. They start companies. But it seemed to also be impressing this like very intense gender script in a highly, grossly quote unquote woke time in which, gender binaries are being reconsidered and always kind of have been, to a lot of degrees. But again, it seemed to kind of operate much like the cul-de-sac of white feminism. Like the place you start is kind of the same place you came out, where the future is female was once again affirming that like straight middle class women who were conventionally feminine were very powerful. What else is new?
Right, and women never exploit other women, or like that doesn't happen. Yeah. In part 3 of the book, you sort of address what can kind of be done to bring about positive change, and you put forth 3 pillars, which I thought were very interesting. Can you talk about each of the 3 pillars that you kind of put forth in the last section of the book?
Sure.
Do you remember what they are? I have.
It's been a little while since I turned it. I was going to say I may have to grab one of my copies just to make sure I don't
I'm
them out of
prepared.
order.
I
okay.
have it always in my back pocket. I have very big pockets. So this was in the Winds of Change, part 3 of the book, which I think it was this book. It was good that you sent us all off with suggestions for how to move forward and try to take everything that we've learned and apply it in a way. So the first pillar of change is stop acknowledging privilege, fight for visibility instead. The second pillar of change is fighting the systems that hold marginalized genders back. And the third pillar of change is hold women accountable for abuse. So we've really touched upon all of these things, really, but I don't know, do you want to, if you don't want to answer this question, I can also move on, but.
No, I think that to just summarize each one, something I saw that happened a lot in my workplace, and even with like women, who I was interviewing, for different pieces that I was writing, was that I watched in real time, and again, I didn't quite realize this in the moment, but I watched white feminism basically attune to the word privilege. So for a bit there, when you said that somebody was privileged, right, like online or, in a meeting or even like in a critical piece of something, it was a real perforation. Like it was meant to challenge the framework by which this conversation, this analysis, this person talking was happening. This is a very privileged viewpoint. But then I watched, again, like white feminism, you can like set your watch by this stuff. I watched white feminism basically like warp that word. So instead of being like about, changing their own framework as to how they approach things, to say you were privileged operated more as a disclaimer. So I'm super privileged, and therefore like I am just going to continue having a low income nanny, who I don't pay very much money to, and also who doesn't have healthcare. I'm privileged, and I watched that happen a lot, where it was like it stopped being like a puncture to a conversation, but also it seemed to, in a very warped way, like applaud them with some sort of racial literacy that they could like identify that, you know, in a dynamic. So I don't really find, like, I've watched, you know, what initially started out to be like a helpful reframework of, you know, a lot of different conversations on gender just be in some ways manipulated to suit white feminism, which is really dangerous and disappointing, but also I think really indicative of the ideology and how it functions. So I think that instead of, you know, necessarily talking about how privileged you are all the time, or, you know, citing that like in confrontations with either your own privilege or your own, you know, class benefits, speaking more in terms of visibility and not necessarily talking about yourself once again, but, you know, giving the floor to a young woman who's of color to actually talk, or, you know, instead of talking about, you know, all the resources that you have, you know, giving over time so that somebody else can have that space or like lead that conversation or have that leadership role or whatever. I think visibility is a lot helpful way to think about that, especially, you know, for a lot of readers of this book, in starting over at the beginning. And then in terms of systems, something I've found really unhelpful in the white feminist discourse is, you know, thinking just way more in terms of the individual and what she needs, rather than collectively looking at a system together that, you know, if you are like a white middle class woman, you know, there is a system that keeps you in a locked hierarchy in which you do have to hire a low income nanny to take care of your children so you can then leave and have this leadership role. And so to stop necessarily looking at it in terms of yourself and what you need, but to look at how the system treats you in relationship to this other woman and, you know, other women who live in your neighborhood or you work with. I think that something that white feminism has been very successful at is getting women to exploit each other in the name of feminism, and to call it feminism to do that. And so orienting yourself and thinking more about the messages that you're getting within the certain framework, I think is way more helpful. And then in terms of women and abuse, I can cite actually really recent example of this. When Me Too was reawakened, you know, under Tarana Burke, I saw something very unhelpful happen with, you know, a lot of women I know, and like, you know, very specific workplaces or environments, basically talking about how, you know, quote unquote, lucky they are to work with only women and to, you know, work in spaces where there aren't men, you know, for whatever reason, whether that's like more reflective of like an industry trend or just like the dynamics of the workplace. And what I felt was really unhelpful about that is just the underlying assumption that another woman can't abuse you or harass you or denigrate you, or, you know, make comments about your body or fat shame you, or harass you about your orientation, or, you know, all these things are implicit when a comment like that is made. And so I go into detail about like different abuse allegations, you know, that have followed very powerful women in our country, and how, you know, for a lot of these women, you know, they identify as feminists. And what does it mean if you identify this way and you are accused of abusing another woman? What does that mean? And I think that thinking about the ways in which power has been used against people, as opposed to thinking about it in terms of gender scripts, is ultimately more beneficial to more people.
Thank you. We're going to do a little lightning round. I'm going to say a phrase or a word, and I'd like you to sort of break it down for us the way you did in the book. Okay, are you ready?
What does that mean?
You'll see what I mean when I give. There's only going to be 3. I'll give you the first one.
Okay.
Okay. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Protesting is the new brunch.
Pussy hats.
So I love the stuff in the book that you talked about, how protesting is the new brunch came about as a phrase, and what its deeper implications really are. It's funny, but it's also, you know, an indicator of something that's not funny at all. Talk a little bit about that, if you can.
Sure. Protesting is the new brunch is a very unfortunate phrase that I saw ascend in the newsroom that I was working in the time. In that this is like after, Trump had been named the Republican candidate, and then shortly after, he won. And then, he started pulling all these executive orders together. He did his immigration ban, like all these sorts of things. And there were a lot of protests. I mean, starting with Women's March, but I pull a lot in the book just to show you how activated, a lot of people were under Trump, and not necessarily all like Democrat identified or, liberal in their values. More people under Trump were protesting all kinds of things. And there was a very unfortunate, I guess you could make the argument that it was a trend piece, but I cited in the book where a female academic said, with what reads like a lot of candidness, like I'm sure, as a quote, it made a lot of sense. If somebody said it to me while I was reporting a story, I would have put it in, where she basically said like a lot of the people that she, was going to brunch with on weekends, they were now protesting every weekend. And that, I think, got translated in a very grotesque way in terms of now, like a lot of things in our country that, are radical or transgressive, and then need to be commodified and sold back to us because that's our marketplace. All of a sudden, a lot of, products as well as like newsrooms and then a lot of other cultural narratives sort of shifted their attention to like, okay, well, how do we sell in this climate? Like if people aren't going to brunch and they're protesting, then we need to be right there selling them things. It's very American.
Very.
So, this unfortunately gave rise to this idea of like performative activism and also the image and merits that come with being an activist. I go into this in a lot of granular detail in the book in terms of, a lot of people I know, myself included, went to these marches and went to these protests, and we took photographs and shared them, as archival materials of like being there, but also just like a place and time, something for us, something to mark our presence. And there, was data that was very reflective of that in terms of a lot of Americans were doing that. But then, unfortunately, brands got involved and, wanted to capitalize on this activation that was happening in our country, and in a really gross kind of blurry way, suddenly like being at these marches, using these hashtags, that I would argue are for archiving moments. I mean, the Library of Congress does keep your tweets, just so you know. It became about, translating this protesting narrative into things you can buy, things you should have, feminist AF tote bags. Like it gets very blurry, especially when you consider that some of the people who were there and who were at these marches, this was grossly enough like an image moment for them. Whether they were aware of that at the time or, were presented with all types of offers after the fact. And it's not even really limited to like the influencer space, like even, a fair amount of women who like I worked with in women's media, like being at these marches, being very visible with signs, holding, anti-Trump paraphernalia and all these types of things, that was had a lot of value in their workplace, like presenting themselves that way on social media, that they were like now this quote unquote big time feminist, with all these values that clearly wasn't, translating over to like the workplace. So that would be my summary of that.
Okay. I do see that the Q&A, I want to leave enough time to get to audience questions. So I'm gonna cut out one of my lightning rounds and we'll do the last one. The word luck, specifically the use of luck as an explanation for success.
I have become very sensitive to this word in my own life, mostly because of the way that I've watched it be used, much like in the way that you and I just talked about, like privileged, being used in white feminist discourse. Yeah. Luck is a precarious term, I think, when you're talking about a lot of things that I explore in the book, like classism or racism or like transphobia or, any of these other like oppressive systems where luck is used to dull the structural analysis. So luck in a lot of ways successfully acknowledges that you have more benefits than other people, but it doesn't acknowledge any of the structural like infrastructure that got you there. So I pull out a lot of like to evidence this, and also to give people like a more colloquial understanding of what I mean when I'm making that analysis. I pull out a lot of celebrity profiles from mainstream women's magazines, where you have these like very young women who are very affluent and white and conventionally feminine in a power suit, talking about how lucky they are. And what that does not accomplish when, you know, especially they're using that term in conjunction with like a feminist narrative, is that it doesn't acknowledge, you know, that we live in a system that requires low wage labor. It doesn't acknowledge that, you know, women as a catch-all are, much like we're seeing in COVID, are like the completely unrecognized source of most labor in this country. Especially we're talking about like domestic labor, caring for children, you know, that sort of thing. It doesn't acknowledge any sort of class advantages. You know, the fact that like I grew up in a house with a lot of books, and then I had people in my life who talked to me about them. Like none of that is acknowledged when you dull them with a shorthand like luck. And also, I do want you to do your other lightning round question.
It'll be, it was, why do you have to be so divisive?
Oh yeah, so I can do that one really succinctly.
Do it quick, because we got a lot of audience questions, and they're going to be mad if we don't get to them. So,
that is a sentiment, basically, that through my research of this book, I have found, you know, is not new. A lot of, you know, women of color, queer women, working class women, immigrant women, all kinds of marginalized genders, like when they're in quote unquote feminist spaces and they bring up something that deviates from the white feminist experience, you know, in terms of like racial harassment, or, you know, anything to do with like immigration in this country, or like any sort of like class infused reality, one of the ways to shut down that conversation is to call that person divisive. And if you've ever been in a scenario where, you know, somebody starts on that script of like, well, we're all women here, and like we need to put the sisterhood first, and they don't mean, you know, SIS, they mean CIS. They're talking about very specific things. Like anytime, you know, in my experience, when somebody tries to put forward collective gender and separate gender from like race or class or like gender identity, that is an attempt to essentially say, don't be so divisive. And actually, I found in my research, that is not a new thing. Alice Paul actually said that about the Black suffragists who were like, hey, can we participate in a movement that is allegedly for all women? And, you know, when she didn't really answer and was silent, and then made them get in the back of the line, and then they were, you know, understandably very angry about that, she was like, why are you being so divisive? Like, this is about women's rights. It's not about Black women's rights. Okay, I think that was succinct enough.
That was perfect. Beth, Tess, I'd like to kick it over to you, and should we get to some of those great audience questions I see coming in?
Absolutely, absolutely. And first, I want to acknowledge to everybody, some people were aware on the chat, we had someone attending who was being very disrespectful and harassing and just outright cruel and inappropriate to another attendee. We put that person off the program. They will not be attending any more Athenaeum programs. I want to remind people that we really here at the Athenaeum are about creating a safe space for us to talk, even if we don't always agree with one another's ideas, but it is very important that we are respectful of one another and one another's personhood and humanity, and treat one another as such. And so my apologies to our guest who was being harassed and put in an unsafe space, and for everybody else who was feeling that also, and distracting from this great conversation. I want to ask some of these questions. First off, I think this one is a really great one. Koa, you placed the start of what you have defined as white feminism at the 1913 suffrage march in Washington, D.C. What connections do you draw, I know you do in your book, to the earlier first wave of feminism, to women like Susan B. Anthony or even Rebecca Latimer Felton, women who used race and racism actually to divide women in the movement? So curious how you might respond to that question.
Sure. So to be clear, just so everyone understands the terms that I'm going to be using here, wave is a very contested term in feminist history and feminist theorists. And by that, I mean like, you know, the academic side of the world. I don't mean like lived experience or, you know, the way you would necessarily speak with your friends. Wave is loaded because it basically collapses a lot of different approaches and ideologies about gender into basically like one homogenized narrative. So I conceded for my book, you know, to use it as like indicative of like certain ideologies or approaches, but you should know that there's a lot of scholarship out there and like thinking, you know, around like not using wave, and actually a lot of more like recent, you know, feminist thinkers and theorists, you know, have stipulated that like wave is not even really accurate, you know, in terms of how movements start now. Like it's a lot more of like a kaleidoscope effect, especially with like digital platforms. Things can accelerate and grow, you know, a lot faster than they could say in 1913. But to the question that was just asked, so keeping all that in mind, first wave of feminism, when that term is used like in like your standard, you know, gender studies class, they're usually talking about the Alice Paul tier. So like to give you like a visual shorthand, you know, the middle to upper class white ladies who had like bobs and were force fed and like picketed outside the White House, those are considered first wave feminists. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, the ladies that were in like the latter end of the 1800s, historians generally refer to them as radical feminists. They are not considered suffragists, even though they supported suffrage. I know it's like way more complicated than it needs to be and is indicative of like academia kind of being obsessed with itself. So I would argue that, so for Elizabeth Cady Stanton and that ilk of the suffrage movement, the reason why historians use the term radical to differentiate them from, you know, the modern suffragists and, you know, again, those ladies with cropped hair, is that those women, you know, while incredibly racist, and very class infused, you know, in their approaches to women having the vote, they didn't necessarily have like commercialism, you know, at their disposal to export a lot of these messages in the way that Alice Paul and a number of her co-organizers did. So like the Seneca Falls, you know, convention, for instance, which is considered in the United States like one of the first formal spaces of like feminist organizing in this country, they weren't really sitting there trying to design like advertisements for suffrage or think about ways to get, you know, suffrage in department stores or think about like accessories you could buy that would support suffrage. That was not a part of their thinking. Whereas for Alice Paul and a number of her contemporaries, that was a big part of suffrage in terms of how people envisioned the movement, but also how they could support it, and then how this particular like ideology of suffrage could get to as many people as possible. And I think a big divide there was that, you know, to the women who were like Alice Paul, who came a generation later, as highly as, you know, they thought of like Susan B. Anthony and those women, they also conceived of a lot of their strategies as unsuccessful because here they were a generation later still not having the right to vote. And so I think understandably they wanted to do something very different from the women who came before them. But I think it was very much aligned in terms of both movements were very adamant about getting rights for certain types of women and definitely not others.
So related to this, getting into the issue of race, of the long shadow of slavery and slaveocracy on our country, and how that has, and you pull into that a bit in your book with white feminism. There's a question about the men who might fit into white men and their place in white feminism.
Now or then?
Especially in thinking of white supremacy.
Oh.
So wondering if where we think about white supremacy and so where do white men maybe fit into white feminism as far as white supremacy is concerned, and also knowing this connection that we have with racism and white supremacy, why are white women classified as a marginal group is part of that question.
I think I can answer that. Two initial thoughts are that I think a place where white feminism from the beginning has always been deeply, deeply ideologically flawed is that it has always set white men as the template for equality. So a lot of suffragists were very kind of upfront about this in terms of viewing their husbands, sons, brothers, dads as equality and trying as white women to achieve that. What is and I see a thread that carries through from that, you know, to today in terms of, you know, women I've worked with, women I've interviewed who, you know, view the male CEO, patriarch, head of the family, I make the most money and therefore I determine the value of everything as equality. And it doesn't really matter, you know, who you exploit to get there, what low wages, you know, have facilitated you having that role, whether it's like domestic work in your house or like exploiting freelancers in the company that you run. It's really just about you having unadulterated power, which I think is one of the things that white feminism has inherited directly from white supremacy, is just power to power's end and no real nuance or understanding, you know, of what that is. I just said this recently in some other press that I did, but where I see this play out a lot is like when I think about my lifetime and white feminist messaging that has been directed at me, especially, you know, as like a middle class woman who, you know, graduated from college and like got to work in all these like elite jobs. The mantra, the white feminist mantra it has always been like, you know, more women in leadership, more women in STEM, more women at the top, more women CEOs, more women on boards. But when I have, you know, approached and interviewed a number of, you know, these very, very powerful women who amplify these messages and support them, the question of like, okay, what do you do when you get there? They never have an answer. And I don't think that's coincidental, because the underlying engine of white feminism from Alice Paul through now has always been just be powerful. But there's no interrogation of like what you'll use that power for, if it's really, you know, that beneficial that you have a powerful role like that, and also like the other women you will exploit to get there. So I think that's a place where white feminism and white supremacy actually have a lot of ideological overlap. But also I think that there is a reason that to some extent, some men in this country, certainly not all, have found white feminism to be very palatable, and that it doesn't really challenge patriarchy in the ways that say like Black lesbian feminists are saying, or like Chicanas are saying, or like Native women are saying, or like a number of queer movements in this country are saying. White feminism is very palatable to power structures as they are. And I think on some levels, a lot of very powerful men are aware of that and support it, you know, for that reason. Like their wife or their partner or their daughter being as exploitative as they are, that's equality.
So here's another question. How do you feel about straight feminism versus queer feminism? The question goes on. Many straight, quote, feminist friends have a limit to their advocacy, and that limit is not impinging on the patriarchy that they often depend on via their male partners.
I would argue that I actually have more experience with this than I would like to, just because like Camille and I, for instance, you know, come from mainstream women's media. We worked at the same company at the same time, albeit for different publications. But, you know, these were very straight environments. I don't think Camille would disagree with me on that. And I mean, I think that like straight feminism, isn't really a term I agree with. I would say like queer illiterate feminism. There have been so many different types of movements that have been propelled by queer women, and also like straight identified women who are extremely queer literate, in their practices, and also like who they worked with and what they were advocating for. I think that a quote unquote feminism that assumes heterosexuality is flawed from the jump. And there's a lot of historical examples of that, in which, kind of like we were talking about with Alice Paul, lesbians and queer women are, relegated to different areas. They're not really involved in, the leadership of the organization. They're assumed to have quote unquote like different realities, which is true, but that becomes the umbrella by which like straight identified feminists and queer illiterate feminists don't engage with them. It's not really a place where they are like trying to find out more, about their life or their reality or what it's like for them to live in society, being either queer reading or like having, a same-sex partner.
So the question that says, we've witnessed how empire in many guises will strategically co-opt movements, ideas, and people and bring a once revolutionary dynamic into the powerful of the dominant power structure. So wondering to what degree did the systems of power determine the boundaries of the early feminist movement?
Oh, I would say it absolutely did. In terms of, the white feminism of like 1915, 16, 17, they weren't trying to, reinvent any sort of system or structure. They were trying to ascend within that structure. And in ways that I think really parallel the white feminism of now, furnishing younger women specifically, and I use younger very pointedly because white feminism is extremely ageist, in not just who is the face of their movement, but also like who they're advocating for, furnishing young women with the skill sets to advance in that structure. And I think not envisioning beyond the current power structure is one of white feminism's many ideological weaknesses.
So I think for a closing question, love to ask you, what is the remedy? How do you see us moving beyond this white feminism that excludes everybody else, that encourages, which you talked about so beautifully in the book, encourages passing as a viable way to succeed under these terms? What do you call for?
I think that the pronoun you use, us, is where we should start. So much of the white feminism that I've been wading through much of my lifetime, and then in my research for this book, seeing what women and other marginalized genders have waded through with white feminism, its enduring narrative is that it's very individually focused, and that you're supposed to think about yourself and your needs, the needs of your own children, the needs of your own family, your own business, your own home. And a big signature in studying so many other movements that are not limited by that ideology is that they think more collectively, and they don't think about, in terms of being disadvantaged, it's not necessarily about one person in their community getting enough so that they can then have the overpriced meat, or like have the senior leadership role, or have birth control access, or have, access to the institution of marriage. It's about everybody having whatever that thing is, and thinking more collectively in terms of structures and systems. So I think to that question, the answer is actually us.
Thank you. Tess has put in the chat the link to buy the book, and Tess, I believe it's going to be also sent to folk when you get out. I hope you will join. Buy the book. It is fabulous. I'm a historian, and so one of the things I love are footnotes and endnotes, and those are here. So Koa did a lot of research, and she documents it so you can follow up also. Great stories, great thinking. As one of our attendees said, hey, I'd never made that connection between feminism and capitalism before, and this book is a really, really wonderful introduction and pulling together so much research into a great analysis, and really, really appreciate that, Koa. And Camille, thank you too for leading a great conversation. This has been so much fun. I hope to get you both back, and for further conversations, hopefully someday we can get you both to the Athenaeum. It's